Today on The Journey, from Steve DeWitt.
Systemic in the Lord's Supper is a reminder that I have tasted of the grace of God. I had this myself, and now there is a natural function that happens when I am glad about something, when I am rejoicing about something, that I want to share that with other people.
Taking communion means so much more than just bread and wine. Today on The Journey, Pastor Steve DeWitt reveals 3 essential ways to approach the Lord's table: through proclamation, anticipation, and examination. We're exploring how this holy meal becomes a powerful reminder of Christ's grace, His great sacrifice, and His promised return. It's the start of a message titled, The Lord's Supper, from our Unity First series. If you've missed any lesson from this study in 1 Corinthians, you can catch up online at thejourney.fm. Here's Pastor Steve DeWitt.
Let's remember what we've seen so far about what was going on with this church. The Corinthian church practiced the Lord's Supper the same way that the early church did, where they had a meal together. The whole church would get together, would have essentially a church potluck, and as a part of the potluck, they would take the Lord's Supper, take those elements and celebrate as Jesus commanded. Well, what happened in the church was that the wealthier members of the church, who were bringing most of the food to the potluck anyway, were showing up early. And along the way, one of them said, well, why should we wait for everybody else? I'm sort of hungry right now. Let's dig in. And so it became their practice where they would get there early, they would eat most of the food, and by the time everybody else showed up, they would look and they would see this little group of people, fat and drunk. So they were like, what are you doing? And there's no food left for us. And one of the theories about this is that there was a big famine in the ancient world, probably going on during this time. So for many of these people, this was like the only decent meal that they would have during the week. The wealthy ate good all the time. So it was creating huge problems in the church and huge divisiveness in the church. And there was kind of a sectarian spirit, cliquey, snobbish kind of spirit amongst some in the church. And so Paul is ticked off about this. And he writes them in no uncertain terms and says, listen, you might be thinking that you're taking the Lord's Supper. You are not taking the Lord's Supper, which we ought to bear in mind. That you can take the Lord's Supper without ever taking the Lord's Supper. You can eat that wafer all day long, and you can drink that juice or wine all day long and never actually experience the Lord's Supper. For the Lord's Supper to be the Lord's Supper, the Lord has to be there. And He is there through the truths that the symbols represent. And spiritually, He meets with His people through the supper in a spiritual way. But He only shows up when the church is doing it right and doing it truthfully. And the church at Corinth was doing neither. So, what we are trying to discern from this is, how should we take the Lord's Supper? And what we've seen so far is 2 characteristics, and we got 3 more today, 2 characteristics already. And we saw beginning in verse 23 that we need to take it thankfully. First of all, with thanksgiving, with thankfulness. And secondly, to remember. That's the word that's repeated twice in this passage. And Jesus said Himself, do this in remembrance of me. And I'm not going to get into that. We spent time on it last week. Here's what I want to talk today with you. 3 more characteristics, and they all rhyme. So they might help you remember. Proclamation, anticipation, and examination. How to take the Lord's Supper. Proclamation, anticipation, examination. So we begin in verse 26 now. Here's what it says. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. Now this little verse holds 2 of the characteristics in it. First of all, notice the word proclaim or proclamation. As you eat this bread and drink this cup, you are proclaiming the Lord's death. So central to what we're doing when we partake in this is a proclamation of Jesus dying on the cross. It is noteworthy that Jesus does not establish an ordinance of remembrance for any of his miracles, for his betrayal, for his beating, for even his flogging. There's none of that. What are we supposed to remember? We are to remember his death, because his death this is the core. When he died on the cross, he died in our place. He bore our guilt. He stood for us as our representative, and he died a human death. The Lord's Supper proclaims that truth because it reenacts it. When I take the bread, I am remembering his body. When I take the cup, I am remembering the new covenant established by his blood. And every time I take that, in a way, the film is playing in my mind of what Christ has done for me, specifically what he did on the cross. And so it centers us. It tethers us. It keeps us from ever getting away from the core of what this thing is really all about. It keeps the main thing the main thing. That's another way to say it. And it keeps some minor thing from ever becoming the main thing. And you well know that in churches, often, way too often, this is what happens. Slowly, the church forgets what the main thing is, and then they become sort of like a nice little club where people like getting together and they have nice social times, and the services are all very happy, and we pat each other on the back, and out the door we go, and it's sort of yippee skippy, yip-de-doo, and isn't this kind of a nice time? That is not the church. Or the church becomes involved in some other thing that might be a good thing in and of itself. It becomes a political action group. That's not what the church is centrally about. The church is about a Savior who died for our sins. And the Lord's Supper keeps that before us. And it keeps us grounded on the foundation of Christ. And that's what we need. If you're here and you're like, I'm sort of over that, I'd like to move on, you don't get it. And so this is vitally important. The supper reminds us every time we take it of who we are. We are sinners. It reminds us of who Christ is, Savior of the world and my Savior. And it reminds us of why he came. He died for sinners. He died for me. And so guess what we do? Every time we take it, we're living that out. We're reenacting that to our heart and to our soul. It also reminds us of why we're here. In one way, it proclaims the gospel to us, but it also reminds us that we are here to be gospel proclaimers to our world. Systemic in the Lord's Supper is a reminder that I have tasted of the grace of God. I had this myself, and now there is a natural function that happens when I am glad about something, when I am rejoicing about something, that I want to share that with other people. I would compare it to you food people, and I know we have some food people in our church. But if you ever talk to a food person, is that the way you'd say, a foodie? If you ever talk to a foodie, you know you've had this experience because they're out there and they're eating at the cool new restaurants and all of that. And so you've probably heard this, somebody's eating at a new restaurant, and so you sit down with them or you're with them and they go, hey, have you eaten at that new restaurant down there on the square or the corner or wherever it is? And you're like, no. And like, oh boy, we went there the other night, and here you go. I had the chicken marsala, and it was like so awesome. And my friend, she had the this or that, and hers looked so great as well. And the other person had, and so we ended up actually sharing. It was kind of like a buffet thing. All of it was good. And I tell you, the atmosphere at that place it's great. It's just really a nice atmosphere, and the prices were pretty good, and the service was good. We can't wait to go back. You ought to check it out. They had a dining experience that they deeply appreciated, and it leads to a wanting to share that with other people. That's the way that we are about everything that we enjoy and we appreciate. We want to share that. We want to proclaim it. And the Lord's Supper reminds us that we are not here for ourselves. We are called by God to take this same dining experience that we have treasured and enjoyed and to share that with other people. So how's that going for you? If you're like me, not like I would like it to. Too often I let things keep me from doing as I ought. But the Lord's Supper reminds us. And I think the more we appreciate it and the more we enjoy it, the more we will want to share it, or in this case, to proclaim it. You do proclaim the Lord's death. And the next phrase says, until he comes, which is our second characteristic today, which is anticipation. We are anticipating the Lord's return. And this is how the Lord's Supper is different than any other memorial thing that you would ever go to. The Lord's Supper, it's not a funeral. It's not like Memorial Day as a veteran. It's not like Martin Luther King Day or President's Day or any of these other special events that we go to where we are remembering somebody that was great and did something significant. And the reason it is fundamentally different is all of those are looking which direction? Backward. They have to look backward. Why? Because they're dead. They're dead. The Lord's Supper is not celebrating a dead person. He is alive. And so our celebrating of it should never have a feeling of a dirge or a feeling of a funeral. It is not a funeral. He is alive and he is coming back. In fact, the early church, when they would partake of the Lord's Supper, they would conclude by the congregation saying, Maranatha, which is an Aramaic phrase, and it means, Lord, come. The whole congregation, Lord, come. I like that. I think that we ought to probably do that. And that sense of anticipation that he is alive, and a thought that this dining experience that we're having at the Lord's Supper is an anticipation of a final consummating dining experience, which is the marriage supper of the Lamb. Revelation tells us that when Christ returns for his bride, his church, that we are going to have this feast, this banquet, and it will be different than the Lord's Supper because now there will be no need for symbols. There will be no sort of mystery and sort of thinking about what it's like or what he's like because he will be with us. So close, the text says, that he will wipe every tear from our eyes. So there will be no sort of imagining and all of that. We'll be eating and we'll be like, he's right there. It's going to be awesome. And so in a way, you could think of your redemption in terms of three suppers. We have the Last Supper, which inaugurates the new covenant. We have the Lord's Supper, which remembers it. And we have the Lamb's Supper, which celebrates and consummates it. Your story is the story of three suppers, and so is mine. We're looking forward to that very much. And so one way to look at the Lord's Supper is to view it as a kind of appetizer for the Lamb's Supper. And you know what appetizers are. They are the things that you order before the main meal comes. And as you eat the chips and salsa, or you eat the fried cheese sticks, or whatever it is that you get, it gets the juices flowing, doesn't it? And it gets you sort of excited. I can't wait. If the appetizers at this restaurant are this good, can you imagine what the meal's going to be like? And that's what we do as we come to the Lord's Supper. Spiritually, the juices begin to flow, and we anticipate when he is going to come back and we will be with him. And that is the blessed hope of the church. That's the blessed hope of the Christian, is to be with him. Proclamation, anticipation, both are vitally important. The third is what we're going to spend the rest of our time with, and that is examination. And I need to tell you, this is a difficult passage, and I'm going to read some of it right now, and some of you are going to be like, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. That rubs me the wrong way. And I want to say to you, it's in the Bible, and I'm going to do the best that I can to help us all understand what it's saying. But this is a difficult passage. Listen to what it says, beginning in chapter 11, verse 27. Whoever, therefore, eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. That's strong, isn't it? That's really strong. I remember when I first became aware of this passage, I was just a boy. I grew up in a Christian home, and I remember I was maybe age 7 or 8, and we were on vacation. And in the church, I grew up in a little church in Iowa. In the church, there was a family, and one of the sons had grown up in the church and had really just walked away from the faith and everything. He was now a 20-something. And we found out that he had died in a really freakish sort of accident. And I remember the adults, I'm just 7 or 8, so I'm not processing much, but I remember the adults sitting around and speculating that God had judged him for his rebellion against God, because the accident was so sort of freaky. And I remember thinking, even as a boy, like, does God do that? And I think those thoughts come from this passage. On the other side of the spectrum are the people, and we might even have a few right now, who are going, what kind of weirdo church is this? I mean, we know that God is love, and he would never do something like that. And so I can't believe they're even talking about this. Why can't we just talk about how good he is to us and how he's for us and all the rest? Many people don't like to think about a God of judgment and a God who acts in our life in decisive ways. So I'm going to say that both of those perspectives are wrong, and I hope my little exposition today will demonstrate why. Context is always critical. Remember what the problem is. The church at Corinth, there were certain people in the church who had a haughty attitude, who thought that they were entitled. They had a sense of entitlement about them. They were acting in a selfish way. They were disregarding the needs of their brothers and sisters, and they were, by this, creating division within the church. That's the context of what Paul is addressing. So, what we have here then is Paul giving a prescription for how to keep that kind of attitude from dividing the church. And he begins by saying this: whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord, so this is the Lord's Supper, whoever takes the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Now that's strong. Unworthy manner, guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. One literal translation is this: they are guilty of murdering Jesus. So, what's that about? What is that saying? Notice something with me. I need to tell you, I think I have misread this pretty much like all my life, and I would guess there might be a few of you that are with me in this. Notice that it says, It doesn't refer to my moral worthiness. It's not the person who takes it that is unworthy. It is an unworthy manner in taking the Lord's Supper. It is not the person who is worthy or unworthy. It is the manner that is worthy or unworthy. Now, why is that important? Here's why. Because I have often read this, and my practice personally, frankly, many years has been, when I take the Lord's Supper, I want to examine. I need a self-examination, and I do a little inventory of my heart, and I kind of ask myself, there's some sin that I have not confessed? Is there something that I am refusing to deal with? Is there, these kinds of things? Many of you probably do the same thing, which is fine and good. But if we somehow think that by doing that, we're now morally worthy to take the Lord's Supper, we are completely missing the boat. On my best day, I don't deserve to take the Lord's Supper. On your best day ever of your life, you have no right to take the bread and the cup. None of us do. We are all unworthy of the grace. That's why it's grace. We don't deserve it. We don't merit it. None of us should say, well, now I'm clean and pure, and so God will be happy as I take the bread and the cup. We are sinners. We will always be sinners. As J.C. Ryle said, a sense of our own unworthiness is the best worthiness that we can bring to the Lord's table. So when I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I am such a loser, morally, spiritually. I don't deserve this. I can't believe now I'm probably ready. That's where we want our hearts to be. The story's told of an old minister who, during the Lord's Supper, saw an old woman, and he noticed that she hesitated to take the cup, and he extended it to her, and he said, "Take it, woman. It's for sinners. It's for you." The Lord's Supper is for sinners. We can't gussy ourselves up enough to have a morally right standing at the table. We don't deserve it. It is by His grace. Now, that doesn't deny the need to confess sin and take inventory of our life and all the rest, but we should be doing those things regularly anyway. To take the Lord's Supper unworthily is to do what the Corinthians were doing. That's why the context is so important. They were being selfish. They were disregarding the needs of others. They were satisfying their own cravings, and they were dividing the church. And so by doing that, essentially what they are doing is they are making a mockery of the unity that Jesus died to establish in the church, which is what the Lord's Supper is saying. Do you see the hypocrisy of that? I have rancor in the church. I've got unresolved conflict. I'm dividing the church. I think I'm better than other people, but then the Lord's Supper comes and I take it. And I'm celebrating, yes, we are one. It's all your grace. Then I look around to the other people. I'm better than you, and I'm better than you, and I can't believe they let you in the church. They're antithetical. So unworthy manner is not unbelief or a lack of moral purity. It is the absence of Christian love and servanthood towards one another. That's what it means to do it in an unworthy manner. It is unworthy because by my attitude now, I am actually taking the side of the enemies of God, the enemies of Jesus. And that is why to do it in an unworthy manner is to be guilty of the body and the blood of Christ.
A convicting message from Pastor Steve DeWitt here on The Journey. Today's message is from our Unity First series, and it's titled The Lord's Supper. To replay it, visit thejourney.fm. Or for an even more convenient way to listen, subscribe to our podcast. Just search your favorite podcast platform for The Journey with Pastor Steve DeWitt. In this season of new beginnings, The Journey continues our mission of bringing Scripture's living truth to you and your family. Each broadcast is designed to deepen your walk with Christ as we begin the new year. And during this special time, we're privileged to share a resource that captures the essence of our faith, The Cradle, Cross, and Crown by Billy Graham. In a world that often rushes past deeper meanings, this cherished book invites you to pause and marvel at God's plan for humanity. Graham, with his characteristic warmth and wisdom, will take you on a journey from the starlit night in Bethlehem to the profound impact of Christ's coming. Within these pages, you'll find a beautiful portrayal of faith, from timeless biblical narratives to beloved hymns that have echoed through generations. Plus, Ruth Bell Graham's poetic voice adds an intimate touch, helping you see our faith through fresh eyes. As we begin 2025, your partnership makes it possible for us to continue sharing these messages of hope. And when you support The Journey with your New Year gift, we'll send you this treasured resource. Call 844-756-8763. That's 844-756-8763. Or you can visit thejourney.fm. That's all our time for today. I'm Tim Svoboda. Be sure to come back tomorrow when Pastor Steve concludes his lesson all about the Lord's Supper. It's the last part of this message and the finale of the Unity First series. Friday on the Journey with Steve DeWitt. Today's program was produced and furnished by Bethel Church in Crown Point, Indiana.